Well, it is 9 o'clock, so we're going to welcome you to today's Farm Office Live here on July 15th. It's been a few weeks since we've been together, and I'm just excited that our OSU Extension Farm Office team is back together today to share with you updates on the dairy markets, the CARES Act, Paycheck Protection Program. Seems like we're giving an update on that every time that we come together. An update on the Corona food agriculture, it's the CFAP program. I can't even remember, Ben, what the CFAP stands for. Corona Food and Agriculture Assistance Program, or Food Assistance Program. You're going to talk to about more. Some grain markets, as well as renewable fuel standards. Just as a reminder who the team is, Diane Shoemaker, it's going crazy this morning. Diane Shoemaker on the left, Barry Ward, Ben Brown, myself, David Marison, Peggy Hall, and Julie Strausser. So we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Just a few housekeeping tips as far as we are recording this, but if you do have questions and answers that you want to ask during the program, don't hesitate to drop those in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring those, as well as on the back side, there will be a quick post evaluation when we're done with this morning's program. So we just thank you for joining us today. And we're going to start off, usually, Diane, we don't start off with the dairy markets, but this week has been sad, depressing, discouraging, I guess. The number -$7.05 comes to mind as far as when dairy farmers went to their mailbox to open up their milk check for June. They got a shock. So I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a start on what is going on with this crazy dairy market.
Thanks, David. It's really a shock, I think, to many in the dairy industry. If you want to go to the next slide, we'll start setting the stage for what has happened. What we're looking at first is the Class 3 price, and we're going to peel back some layers on this whole dairy pricing thing. But the Class 3 price for Ohio dairy farmers is usually the basis of what they get paid per hundredweight. And as we've mentioned before on Farm Office, Class 3 prices have been very poor. We've been in an extended downturn for the past 4 or 5 years. And so in mid-July, everyone was very happy to see Class 3 prices hit $17.55, raise until we hit that $20.45 you see in November. And the increasing milk prices in the dairy world usually encourage farms to add cows and produce more milk because there's some profit opportunities. So it's not surprising to see that following that high in November, we started to see some price declines because we had more cows and consequently more milk. And then that was also layered with our normal spring flush. So we were starting to see prices decline somewhat. And then in March, we see that star. It's hard to forget that stay-at-home order when the pandemic hit. And then we experienced some very serious declines in milk price resulting from disruptions in supply chains and demand and type of demand. And we saw that price drop to a low of $12.14 last month in May, or for the May price. We're always about a month off on dairy pricing. But meanwhile, in that time frame, demand increased for primarily cheese, and we saw the protein price go up to $4.53 a pound, which is very high in the dairy world, and that pushed that June Class 3 price to $21.04, and we're still seeing Class 3 prices trading in that $20 and higher range. So, you know, we were feeling, wow, you know, here's an opportunity. It was unexpected to see some recovery in prices and some relief on the farm. However, if we hit that next slide, rumblings started about a week to 10 days ago that as we look at the difference between class prices, that the news in the milk check was not going to be very good. So even though the Class 3 price was announced at $21.04, and that 3.5% butterfat is just our standard test, that class 3 price is announced at, even though it was announced at 2104, there was this producer price differential, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, and it is negative, and negative to an extent we have never seen. So from that 2104, there's a subtraction of $7.05. So the uniform price, which is simply the difference between class 3 and the announced producer price differential, is $13.99. So that is the price that our farmers are going to see in that mailbox when they open up that check. Now, it can be higher or lower than that. And what could make it higher is if a dairy farm produces a higher amount of butterfat than 3.5%, or protein that's greater than 2.99%. And that can help increase that a little bit. But as a basic price, that $13.99 is what we're going to see as the foundation of our milk checks. So Federal Milk Marketing Order 33, what does that mean? We are part of Federal Milk Marketing Order 33. There's 11 federal orders in the country. It's a system that was voted in place by dairy farmers in the 1930s, and actually dairy farmers paid to run that system. So for every 100 weight of milk that they sell, 5 cents is taken to support that federal order system. And there's an important function to those federal order systems. They were developed to provide a uniform and orderly system to discover price and to equitably distribute proceeds of higher values of milk across dairy farmers. So how is that done? If you'd hit the next slide, please. Milk is actually broken down into 4 classes. And class 1, as you can see, is typically our highest value product, and it is considered fluid milk, so bottled milk, buttermilk, eggnog. Class 2 utilization are the components that are used to make ice cream, cream, cottage cheese, the soft products. Class 3, which we talked about, that class 3 price is representative of the ingredients that go into hard cheeses and whey as a byproduct of the hard cheeses. So that would be cheddar cheese, mozzarella, those types of cheeses. And then class 4 is a way to price the components that go into butter and powder as a byproduct. That'd be non-fat, dry milk, those kind of products are class 4. So why do we care? Well, for one thing, class 1 is typically in our system the highest value milk. Class 3 and 4 are the lowest values. But those are the class 3 and the 4 products are the ones that are used to, that's where price discovery happens. So the processors that make cheese and whey and butter and non-fat report weekly to the National Ag Statistics Service quantities and value of those products. And then those values are used by the Milk Market Administrator to set the values of fat and protein, those class 3 and 4 prices. And then the prices for class 1 and class 2 are built upon those. So if it sounds confusing, it's because it is. And there are people who spend their careers working on these prices and announcing those. There are reams of rules attached to these formulas and how to participate in the federal order. But in a nutshell, class 3 and class 4 are used to discover prices, and then class 1 and 2 prices are built upon those. In 2000, there was major federal order reform. We had a lot more federal orders. There was a lot of reform that took place, and we are now down to those 11 federal orders. And at that time, our class 1 price was built on the higher of the class 3 or the class 4 price. So class 1 was always higher than the class 3 or 4 price. In 2019, there was a rule change. Changing rules in the federal order require somebody to say, I think this would be a better way of doing this. They have to get a consensus among players in the federal order system, a proposed rule. If that's accepted, it has to be voted on in the federal order, and farmers vote on whether that order, that rule change should take place. And their choice is we either accept the rule or the federal order disappears. So it's kind of a lengthy process, but a group of processors and co-ops came together and pushed for a rule change, got that approved. And so that formula became, instead of class 1 being built on the higher of class 3 or 4, it is now built on the average, simple average of class 3 or 4 plus 74 cents. So that led to the situation that we have today. David, the next slide. What we're looking at here are the class prices for classes 1, 2, 3, and 4 from January through May this year. And this is pretty normal looking. You see class 1 is the blue line. It's the highest. So class 1, every month, class 1, that fluid milk, has had the highest value of all of our class prices. Class 2 is lower. It's been higher than class 3. It's usually higher than class 3. You can see in January and February it was about the same as class 3, and class 4 has been the lowest. So what happened in June? Let's take a look. So in June, we had a major inversion of class 1 and 3 prices. So that class 3 increased $8.97 from May to June and was announced at that 21.04. But our class 1 price was $13.42. So suddenly our manufacturing price is higher than our fluid price. And when we look at the difference between class 3 and class 4, we're looking at an $8.14 difference there. So let's take a look at the next slide, David. We're going to go back to just January through May. So utilization of milk in our federal order system looks pretty consistent across time. So class 1 utilization is typically higher, although it kind of switches back and forth with class 3. So they're somewhere between 31 and 35% utilization. And that higher class 1 utilization is a benefit in our order, because when class 1 is the higher value milk, then the higher utilization we have of class 1, the more that benefits farmers in that producer price differential. And then class 2 and class 4 utilization is typically lower in our federal order. That top dashed red line is the total pounds of milk that were pooled on federal order 33. And that averaged 1.74 billion pounds. And you can see that line doesn't move a whole lot. It's fairly steady in that 1.7 billion pound range. But as we'll see in a moment, that's not going to look the same for June. So the question is why? And why did we have this big negative price producer differential? So let's take a look at what can happen in the federal order. So a really important point is that class 1 processors, so if I bottle fluid milk, I have to participate in the federal order system. So the difference comes that class 3 processors may participate in the federal order system. And it's typically to their benefit to participate, because class 1 has the higher value milk. And so if class 3 is announced, say, $2 lower than class 1, that $2 difference, class 1 processors contribute to the pool, and then that is shared among all farms that have milk that's pooled on the federal order. And the benefit of that then is that a cheesemaker who normally would get that lower class 3 price for their product, for the milk, for the milk that ultimately goes in the product they sell, they can get a share of that $2, that higher value, and I'm just picking $2 arbitrarily, they can get a share of that higher value of the class 1 milk and pay it to their producers. So the objective is that no matter where a farmer sells their milk within the federal order system, they are all paid the same for their milk. That blend price, the higher value of class 1 plus the lower value of those manufactured products, they all get a blended price that's equal across farms. It's not dependent on, do I live close to a fluid plant and am able to sell my milk for more, or my milk has a higher value sold as fluid milk than it does going into cheese. So class 1, to make this all work, the people with the higher value milk have to participate in the federal order. So class 1 processors must participate, but everybody, those class 3 processors may participate. Now, we've had challenges with pooling milk and then depooling and repooling, jumping in and out of the federal order pool in the past. So there are rules that limit, as a cheesemaker, how much milk I can take out of the federal order pool 1 month and put back in the next month. So David, can we go to the next slide, please? So what happened between May and June? In May, the prices, class 1 was $14.95, class 3 was $12.14. That's kind of our typical look where class 1 fluid milk is worth more than manufactured milk. In June, we had that huge price, not just a price inversion, but a huge price inversion. So class 1 was equal to $13.42 and class 3 was equal to $21.04. So why did class 1 go down? Well, it's set on class 3 and 4 for the previous month, and we had really low prices in May. So the June class 1 was going to be lower. Then we look at utilization. How much milk was pooled on the federal order and in what classes? When we look at the total pounds pooled, we went from 1.78 billion pounds in May and down to 1.29 billion pounds in June. And why was that? When we look at the utilization, that helps tell that story. We had our kind of typical utilization in May of about a third each for class 1 and 3. But in June, we had class 1 utilization at 40%. Now, if class 3 utilization had stayed the same, that actually would be favorable for our federal order. But it was because we lost that 4 billion pounds of milk that's typically class 3, and that class 3 utilization dropped to less than 10%. So why did it do that? Class 3 suddenly has the higher value of milk. And that means that those processors would have to pay in the higher amount, which would then be shared across processors. However, a great deal of that milk was depooled. Obviously, about 400 million pounds was depooled. And so we don't have that big chunk of dollars then to be shared across farms. It just never existed. So that pooled price, that blend price is really down to that $13.99. So if we look at that graphically here, what happened in January through May, which is more typical of our federal order, and then what happened in June, that class 1 utilization went up, but it was because class 3 dropped so dramatically and our pool and our pounds pool dropped so dramatically. So what are our expectations for the future? We ended up with this, next slide, David, this uniform price of $13.99, which is higher than it was in May, but certainly still below the cost of production for Ohio's dairy farms. As we look at what will continue to happen, we still have spreads. Final slide, David. So we look at, these are class 3 and 4 futures from July into the following year. We still have these huge spreads between class 3 and class 4 prices. And as the average of that plus 74 cents is used to set the class 1 price, when that difference is more than $1.48 between the class 3 and 4 values, that class 1 price is going to be lower than our higher of the class 3 or 4 price. So we're looking at probably continued negative producer price differentials for the next few months. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have that more normal relationship between class 3 and 4 values. Part of that is potentially clearing stocks of, what sets the class 4 price. It's butter and powder. And when there are large stocks of those items, that's going to drag on the class 4 price. So we want to see a good, strong class 3 price, but we also want to see a good, strong class 4 price to be able to see overall that statistical uniform price, end of the month, what comes in the milk check of the dairy farm at the farm to become a price that will support cost of production. So we're looking at continued challenges for the next few months, even though we see trading, very high trading on those contracts, it's still going to be a challenge at the farm level. So that concludes our depressing dairy news of the day. You're muted, David.
You know what's bad when you have 2 mute buttons on your headset and you unclick one but not the next. We do have one question that came in from Denny about, is the dairy farmer charged the federal milk marketing charge that I believe you mentioned it was 5 cents, even if they market direct to the processor? And I don't know if you want to answer that now or get back to Denny on the chat.
Well,
direct to the processor.
Farms do market direct to processors, but they have to participate in the federal order. Now, if your processor does not participate in the federal order, and there might be a few cheese plants that might not, they have a choice. If that processor does fluid milk, they have to participate. So it's a rare case where there would not be a federal order charge. Some cooperatives, you might not see it listed separately as FMMO 5 cents, but if you dig through the deductions, it's usually there in some form.
Great, thanks, Diane. Well, we'll keep our pulse on this for sure. The depressing dairy, it seems like dairy has been a roller coaster all year long, as it will continue with all the impacts, not only coronavirus, but just, I don't know any dairy economist who's probably been right during 2020. So it's kind of crazy ride. So with that, speaking of another crazy ride with the coronavirus, the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program, we provide updates on this every time we come together. Barry, you have another quick update, not starting to slow down on updates, but Barry, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a quick update on the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program, just an update there.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's good to be back and with everyone. It's good to have you all with us. Just want to remind you, if you have questions, there's a couple of portals that you can ask us questions. And I just want to make one comment about Diane before we move on, that she is becoming a milk marketing expert in spite of her intentions over the years. So it looks like you're I'm not going to say the new Cam because you're totally different, but no, maybe that was a cheap shot. No, sorry, Cam, if you're on, but no, you're turning into quite the marketing specialist. I'm glad you are, and probably Ben too, but that stuff is deep and really difficult to get your head wrapped around. It's appreciate that update. This is kind of just a few bullet points about the Paycheck Protection Program, and hopefully, Peggy, you'll chime in if you've got some additional comments. As David mentioned, there's not a lot new. Some of this is just rehashed, and really, some of these bullets are exactly what we did 3 weeks ago or so that I kind of refurbished a little bit and updated. So we did get some news. The application window is still open, or it's been reopened. Congress sent it over, over the month break from June 30th to July 1st. The Senate and the House wrestled with a couple of bills, and the president signed a bill July 4th, I believe, and the bill to extend the authority for commitments for the Paycheck Protection Program, that top red bullet there. In other words, the PPP extension. So you have it now until August 8th to fill out an application for the Paycheck Protection Program through your lender to get support if you haven't done this yet. So if you've been just procrastinating this whole time, or if you weren't sure if you really wanted to go through all the paperwork, the option is still there. So we have until August 8th, at least at this point, under the old PPP program. So that's still, I guess, good news. Now there's a lot of rumblings in Washington and everywhere else across the country, those that have an interest in this. And of course, as COVID continues to give us some problems in the business sector, many in Washington and the Senate and the House are looking at other alternatives as far as extensions, alternative PPP programs. The first bullet that I have up there, number one, is just talking about one of the issues that we still don't have real clarity on, and that's whether or not the owner compensation replacement portion of the PPP loan is requiring you to get any kind of forgiveness, whether or not you have to write yourself a check. So if you have a business, a Schedule C business, a Schedule F business, which many of you on here may have, or your clients may have, then these are the folks that are looking at how am I going to qualify for full forgiveness for the PPP loan when I do go to file that application for forgiveness. Do I need to write myself a check? If I have written, or if I have an application for owner compensation replacement as a part of the PPP program, and we don't have any real clarity, that's something. As a safe alternative would be to write a check to yourself, even if the check is deposited back into the same account. So that's something that I guess is probably a safe alternative. We still continue to have questions. SBA, Treasury, they haven't really given us any clarity on that. Okay, and moving on then, looking at what's being discussed in the future, there's ongoing discussions on legislation that would grant forgiveness to all PPP loans under $150,000. There's even a name for this possible bill, the Paycheck Protection Small Business Forgiveness Act. So this is, I know, being pushed by many banks across the country as a way to eliminate a lot of headaches for them and their customers. No decisions yet, but there's been a lot of discussion and even some bipartisan support, as I understand it, and some of the things that I've read. And I know some of these things you may have read as well. Still no decision yet as far as reversing the Treasury and IRS ruling about the tax deductibility of the forgivable portion of the PPP loan. So if you have the loan forgiven, as of now, those expenses are not tax deductible when you go to file your 2020 taxes this next year. So whether or not that was the intent of the legislation, many legislators have gone on the record and said that it's not. But there's ongoing discussion. I know as we talk here today that many are trying to reverse that or have that portion of the forgivable portion of the PPP loans be tax deductible. Then the last bullet that I've got here is there's some bipartisan discussion ongoing about another more targeted round of PPP, whether it's another extension, another infusion of cash, or a completely different bill. One that's being discussed is this Prioritized Paycheck Protection Program Act, which would be more targeted in this next round and perhaps be targeted for those even smaller businesses than what we saw with the first Paycheck Protection Program, perhaps under 100 employees. And there's other discussions ongoing as far as what details there may be, but stay tuned, I guess. I guess, David, we're not done with the PPP program. And Peggy, I'm not sure if you have any additional comments or if we lost you, but okay. Let's go on then, David. Just as more of a reminder, the employee retention credit for employers subject to closure due to COVID-19. So this is if you weren't applying for and receiving a Paycheck Protection Program loan. This goes way back to the beginning when the CARES Act was passed. If you didn't participate in PPP, there is a fully refundable payroll tax credit equal to 50% of the qualified wages paid to each employee. So again, you have to have employees to qualify. And, you know, one of the things that sticks out here is that businesses have to basically have a significant decline in gross receipts for a given calendar quarter. Go down here to the second bullet item there in the middle of that slide. And this is, I think this is the way that farms may qualify with this program. Again, if you don't have a PPP loan, because the first bullet there, businesses fully or partially suspended during the calendar quarter due to the orders from an appropriate governmental authority limiting commerce, et cetera. Farms are really going to have difficulty qualifying under that particular provision. But the second provision, perhaps, you know, farms can see a 50% decline in gross receipts in a given quarter, and some may see that, and especially grain farmers, you know, as they determine when they're going to market grain throughout the year, they may be able to push some of that that marketing into a different quarter to actually allow themselves to qualify. I'm not sure how SBA is going to look at this or the IRS, but I think we would probably be remiss if we didn't at least mention that possibility of qualifying for this tax credit. And then there's some additional details that I'm not going to run through on this particular provision of the CARES Act, but just know that it's there, I guess, and it's especially there and possible for those that haven't had Paycheck Protection Program loans. So let's go on. Just wanted to mention, just this past week, we have a new and final version of a new 1099, or a, well, it's a new old 1099. We used to have the 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation, and now it's been resuscitated and brought back. So for those that have and are paying independent contractors, for example, and for those that that have employees that don't qualify as employees and are more independent, this is the 1099 that you will eventually fill out for this next year for the past year. So in 2021, as you start to file and send those 1099s out, be aware of this. The 1099 NEC and the 1099 miscellaneous has changed as a result of that. So you're going to have to go through all of the 1099 miscellaneous and see how that may change for you as a filer. But this is more of just a notice. You know, this is something that we're all going to have to deal with this next year. Let's go on to the next one. The last one that I've got, at least, is just, I guess, a little promo. We have a OSU Income Tax School summer update and federal income tax and financial update. It's a webinar on August 13th. So as an extension of Farm Office Live and the Farm Office team, this webinar, who I'm working together with Julie Strausser and John Lawrence on, it's going to be offered. Now, this is for continuing education credits for tax professionals, so it does carry a cost. But it should be an excellent webinar if you want to see some of the different issues that we've got listed there as far as the topics and get the latest on what's going on. We encourage you to join us, and that's August 13th from 10 to 3:30. And you can see there as far as the continuing education credits that are offered. And we'll look forward to having and seeing many of you on there with us, we hope. So, David, I'll turn it back to you.
Great.
Unless he's got some additional comments on PPP. I didn't mean to hog all the time there. So if you have any thoughts, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, I dropped off. I was.
And now you can see why she dropped off, because she froze. So
And
we don't have any
bandwidth
thoughts of
problems.
bandwidth problems. So with that, thanks, Barry. I would encourage folks, if you've never seen John Lawrence teach in that, this would be a great Zoom meeting. And then we'll just switch gears and a little bit here and go to Ben. Ben?
Hey, David, real quick. Diane, did you have anything you wanted to say? I saw you trying to signal.
I had a question for Barry. There's a lot of farms that hire custom work. So would that custom work be on the new 1099 form, or would it continue to be on miscellaneous income?
That's a good question. I'm going to have to do a little bit of research. I think it's going to be on the NEC, but let me do a little bit of digging and just to be certain on that.
Appreciate that.
Great. So now we'll switch to the CFAP update and turn it over to Ben Brown. Ben, there was an announcement came out just over this past week about some additions with specialty crops. So I wanted to hand it over to you to talk to about some of the updates on that side on specialty crops.
Yes, thank you, David, and appreciate everybody being with us today. I don't have a lot on CFAP update. The program's pretty much operating the same way it always has. There's very few changes for our traditional crops, or traditional row crops, I should say, and then livestock. At least in my impression, a good chunk of our livestock producers, even though they haven't participated in government programs prior to this or FSA programs, are finding it to be a fairly simple and straightforward process. The only limitation that I continue to hear, and it's really, again, it's not FSA's fault, but they are having to do remote interactions at the current point, meaning their offices aren't open. And so some people are finding that a little bit challenging, especially with crop reporting that's due today as well. A lot of folks that have never filed crop reports online are now filing those online as well. So just a little bit of challenges there, but again, that's not FSA's. You know, we're all in this global pandemic. We're all working from home too here at Ohio State. So I want to give a thanks to the FSA for doing a lot in kind of some challenging conditions. So the program really hasn't changed for most of us. Really, the only thing that we were watching for is what additional commodities would be added to the program. And I have a couple of announcements here related to this. We had been asked to help to look into price impacts of goats and in some cases broilers, chickens, and eggs. And so I had expected those to, and they did. They all submitted an application for approval to be included in the program. So when I saw the initial announcement that additional commodities had been added, those are kind of the ones I thought, along with aquaculture, those are the ones I thought we'd see added. Instead, what we got a long list of specialty crops. Nothing against this. Specialty crop prices are hard to come by and hard to find. And so I'm not surprised at all to see a lot of specialty crops being able to prove and provide evidence that they had been hampered. So we had about 40 crops added. As you can see, there's a long list. I've kind of bolded the ones that I think I hear, at least in Ohio, that we have eligible crops of: beets, blackberries, collard greens, and lettuce. Certainly we could have those others in the state as well, but I just wanted to point those out because I know we have producers of those crops. We did have a couple of changes in payment rates for I think there's 14 commodities there, for apples, blueberries, garlic, potatoes, raspberries, tangerines, taro, peaches, the list goes on. Basically what we saw there is they didn't get deducted. They actually got a little bit more payment in that CARES funding because they were able to prove they had a 5% drop before the middle of April as well. So additional payments there. Action items, if you have people that you work with that have these crops, or you're starting to get questions related to how do you go about, the process is still the same. Nothing has changed. If a producer has filed an application and it was previously denied, so let's say they filed an application for let's just say beets, for instance. It wasn't an improved commodity before, but let's say they had an application and it was denied. If an additional commodity here makes you now eligible, all you have to do is submit a new application. You still have to go through the process and submit a new application. However, if your application was approved, so let's say you had watermelon or pumpkins, but you also had one of these other commodities that is now included in this list, all you need to do is call in the FSA office and ask for an amendment to your original application. So no new application needed if you are approved for other commodities, and now you have commodities in this list that are eligible. However, if you have a change in payment rate only, so for instance, like let's say before you had certified apples had been approved for an apple CFAP payment, there's nothing you need to do. FSA is going to make that adjustment for you. However, I always encourage, it doesn't hurt anybody to check. So if you're sitting there and you think, well, I've been approved, but I see my commodity on the list, do I need to do anything? As long as it's just a change in payment rates, you don't need to do anything. The other big news that I'll just say about CFAP really quick as we wrap up, right now, USDA feels like they're going to have enough money to pay out the additional 20%. Remember, 80% is a paid upfront approval of the application. 20% was held back if there was additional, sufficient funds left. We're just a little over 6 weeks till the end of the deadline. The way we've been progressing with applications and payouts, it gives USDA confidence that last week they announced that they expect to pay that remaining 20%. So just something to keep in mind as we move forward, but no major changes to the CFAP program. I would just encourage people that if you're eligible, it's one of those things that if you need the funds, here's an opportunity for it, and it's better to do it now than to wait 6 months from now when there is no process and you didn't get funds now and you need them 6 months from now. So just something to keep in mind. And David, I think that's all I have to say about CFAP. If you want to move ahead to.
Great. Yeah. The next, this is a holdover item. We didn't get to it in our last Zoom webinar from June, but it was about renewable fuel standards. So we wanted to make sure we gave some time to that. So I'll just advance to your next slide.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. So this is something, I'm going to channel my inner Peggy Hall. Peggy inspires me in a lot of ways, but I think when it comes to biofuel policy, I really feel like I just want to be a lawyer, I think is how I can best sum it and work with Peggy. So many of you know that I have an interest in biofuels, and it's something that's going to continue to grow this summer as I'm giving the biofuel outlook for the Midwest Grain Market Conference in August. But it's something that I follow deeply, and if you want to see politics at its most creative, just follow ethanol and biofuel policy is all I have to really say to really ramp up a lot of the unique things that we get when it comes to biofuels. I want to break this down in a couple of things. So when we started this and we're talking about topics for our last Farm Office Live, we had some news related to ethanol policy that was kind of circulating and making its way through ag media. That's kind of toned down now just because we're kind of in this wait and hold pattern. So this isn't pressing by any means at the moment, but it's just kind of nice stuff to know. So I'll go through this pretty quickly, but if you have additional comments, I'd be glad to take that. Just as an important reminder to make sure we're all on the same stage, the biofuel mandate that we have in this country is still a percentage standard. For some reason, there's a big misunderstanding between a percent standard and a volume standard. And I've had to explain this to some really, really important lobbyists, even in Ohio, when they come out and say, well, the law says 15 billion gallons, we're going to consume 15 billion gallons of ethanol. Well, that's not entirely correct. The law is still a percentage standard mandate, meaning that EPA provides a volume requirement, meaning that 15 billion gallons. And then we divide that by how much projected motor fuel we expect to use in the next year. So right now we're waiting on estimates for the 2021 compliance year, so next year. we'll take whatever the motor fuel estimate for next year, we'll take that from the EPA volume requirement, let's say 15 billion gallons, and we'll subtract off small refiner exemptions. And that's the percent that refiners, small refiners, have to abide by, or not even small refiners, all refiners have to abide by. So for instance, if the percentage standard comes out to 10%, every gallon of gas that a refiner sells has to either contain 10% ethanol or biofuels, or they have to buy the equivalent paperwork, right? So there's still an obligation cost there. And that's what I'm talking about. So the obligation to the parties is the total gasoline or diesel that they produce times that percentage standard. And depending on their compliance, and their obligation moves based on that percentage standard. So what's happened in ethanol lately, and why are we all like sitting here on pins and needles? And I sit here and I just kind of, it's been almost a reality TV show to watch this. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but I also kind of mean it a little bit. So a little bit of history. The Clean Air Act exempted all small refiners, and small refiners is designated as a refiner that produces less than 75,000 barrels a day. That's a small refiner. So the Clean Air Act waived all small refiners up till 2011. Then in 2011, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, could extend waivers for 2 years to 2013. And then after that, they could ask for an extension, meaning that that 2-year refiner waiver they got could be extended. And that's what I show there in the third bullet point is, if they wanted to continue, they had to ask for an extension. However, what we saw is that the small refiner waivers started to really grow rapidly starting in 2016. And this is partially due to a change in command at EPA, but it's also due to a court case against the Obama administration saying that the Obama administration was too strict on these waivers. The Supreme Court ruled that the Obama administration was not following the intent and was being too, it wasn't Supreme Court, it was an appellate as well, was being overly strict. And so, but when the new administration came in, we went from 7 refiner waivers in 15 to 35 in 2017, to 31 in 2018, and then for 2019, which again hasn't been finalized yet, there's currently 27 waivers in the process. So they've grown pretty substantially, and this has come at the distaste of corn farmers, soybean producers, and Midwest senators that support biofuels. So in January of 2020, U.S. Corn Growers Association and others, there was multiple parties, sued the EPA for overstepping authorities by granting waivers that were not continuously extended. So meaning that a small refiner there was 3 of them that they were really questioning, that they felt EPA had given a small refiner exemption to in 2016, 2017, and 2018 that had not had them previously. So therefore it was not an extension, these were new waivers. And that was their case, really. And the court ruled in favor of them, saying, yes, that is correct. That is outside the law. That's outside congressional intent. These waivers, or these refiners were given non-appropriate, they were given waivers when they shouldn't have. However, in June, and this is why it was big headlines last month, in June, EPA announced that they were considering 52 gap waivers going back to those previous years. So basically, EPA, went back and said, we're going to make all these small refiners now compliant. We're just going to go back, fill in all the waivers in years they didn't ask for waivers to keep them eligible for future years. And this is where corn farmers and really everybody kind of looked at this and scratched our head, because how can you ask for compliance and hardship, 7-8 years after the fact? When the compliance years are done, the RINs are no longer traded. It'd be hard to prove economic hardship. So, if Peggy has points you want to talk about, at least to me, it seems like it could be hard to prove that, back in 2012, a small refiner had a hardship when they didn't ask for a waiver, and now they're asking for a waiver in 2019 just to be eligible for future years. Is something I think will be hard to prove in court. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll leave that to professionals. And Peggy, I'll let you chime in here at the end. But I do want, David, if you'd go to the next slide, please. I just kind of want to show what's happened. So the graph on the left is showing those gallons waived from small refiner exemptions, and as you can see, it grew really rapidly from 2016 to 2017. We've kind of tailored down. The red bars there are my estimates given those 27 applications already in the system. That does not count if those 52 gap waivers get approved. I expect we're going to see a lot more oil refiners or small refiners ask for an exemption so they can, or an extension so they can keep those for future years. So that does not include that. That just includes those 27 that we saw that applied for an exemption. However, kind of the misunderstanding is that we're losing 1.2 billion gallons of ethanol blended into our motor fuel. That's how it's perceived in the media, is that we've just lost this demand of ethanol. Well, that's not entirely correct. In fact, that's not correct at all. I go back to our percentage standard conversation, and this is really the graph on the right. Gasoline is competitive, or ethanol is competitive with gasoline. And so there is an incentive for a lot of these gas pumps on your corner gas station to blend ethanol into the gas stream, because they're saving money, and in return they can pass some of that, about 6 cents, onto the producer. So there's an incentive for them to use gasoline. So even though there's not the obligation, oil refiners do not have to submit paperwork, there's still the incentive to blend ethanol into the fuel stream. So that's what I'm showing you here over here on the right, is even during this period of really high exemptions, we have maintained a pretty flat standard of gasoline and ethanol ratio, or the component of ethanol to our gasoline. To the fact it's actually been kind of improving the last couple of years. So the bigger driver of ethanol consumption isn't necessarily these waivers, it's how much gasoline and oil we're consuming by driving and moving about in the country. So Dave, if you'd go to the next slide real quick. Basically what this ultimately means is the real effect to producers isn't how much ethanol is being used now, it's how much ethanol could be used in the future. So what I've got here is a little bit of graphics showing you how these RINs, or renewable identification numbers, actually work towards farmers. So let's start up here at the top. An ethanol plant produces a gallon of ethanol. Associated with every gallon of ethanol is a RIN, or that piece of paper. Then they can either sell that ethanol to a fuel terminal or an oil refiner, or sell it right to the pump, right to the gas station, right? So the fuel terminals, they have an obligation. They have to meet that percentage standard, that 10%. They can either meet that percentage standard by blending ethanol, buying ethanol and blending it into the fuel, or buying those pieces of paper. The way the papers come into the market is the retailers, back over on the side, when they buy ethanol, they're getting those RINs because they're coming with the gallon of ethanol, but they have no obligation to provide those to EPA. So now all of a sudden they've got a piece of paper that they can sell to somebody else, right? And that's money to them. They can make money on those pieces of paper if they can find somebody to buy it. So if the oil refiner is buying those pieces of paper from the terminal, everybody's, the terminal's getting money to increase infrastructure, increase, E15, E85 at the pump, and then they supply that to EPA. So that's what I'm describing. So let's, now David, if you'd go to my last slide related to RFS, this is what ultimately we all should be concerned about. And so I understand the position that corn farmers want to make about how these waivers are killing demand for ethanol. My pushback would be, you're talking about the wrong demand. It's not killing your current demand. What it's doing is it's killing your future demand. When the RIN price goes up, and think about this, when the RIN price goes up and you have compliance, an oil refiner has compliance to either buy ethanol or buy a piece of paper, and those pieces of paper are getting more expensive, all of a sudden your local gas station on the corner is now getting more money for their pieces of paper and has more money to add infrastructure related to ethanol, right? So it's good for your local gas station for RIN prices to go up. It is bad for oil refiners when RIN prices go up, because now they have to pay more. They either have to buy ethanol or pay more for those pieces of paper. So RINs effectively kind of become our price signal. And that's what I've done here, is I've just pointed out, I've plotted D6 ethanol RIN prices going back to 2018. And you can see why ethanol and biofuel policy has really become popular the last couple of months. At the beginning of the year, when the court ruled that those three small refiners in the 9th Circuit District, which is basically Utah, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico, I think. Peggy, you might have to correct me on that. But when they ruled that those refiners were out of line and not following the law, we saw RIN prices shoot up, right? Because that basically created a big demand for those pieces of paper. However, on the March 5th, the Trump administration announced that EPA will appeal the ruling, and we saw RIN prices fall, right? Basically saying that the government was going to challenge that ruling, appeal it, and we saw RIN prices fall back down. However, by the end of the month, there's a timeline on when anybody can do that. By the end of the month, EPA did not appeal the ruling, and we saw RIN prices start to climb back up until we got to June 18th, when EPA announced those 52 gap waivers. And we've seen kind of choppy waivers since then. And right now we're just waiting to see what US EPA is going to do. Are they going to do anything with these waivers? Amongst all this, just last week or a week and a half ago, 2 weeks, I guess, the US administration announced that they were going to delay that 2021 blending mandate indefinitely. Now, it's not uncommon for administrations to wait till later in the year to announce these, because they're very politically sensitive. You're basically pitting Midwest farmers against Southern oil, Western belt oil interests, and you get this competition to the fact that Joni Ernst and Ted Cruz right now are duking it out, blocking a EPA administrator because they disagree with how EPA is treating these RIN prices. And so as a result, it's kind of created gridlock because they're both in agreement that they don't like EPA, but they dislike EPA for the wrong reason. So it's a very politically sensitive issue, and it's hard to get anything through related to this. So I think that's my last slide for RFS. Peggy, do you have anything you want to add? All right, did I do okay? I don't want to push my lawyer abilities because I have none, but I do love biofuel policy.
Oh, you did great, Ben.
Thanks, Peggy. Okay, so last topic here really quick, and then I'll stop talking. And we'll go through this really quick. I just got asked to provide a Midwest grain market update as part of this. So I just kind of want to talk about the black swan real quick. For livestock, we seem to be returning back to a normal pace. Pig slaughter and pig processing is above where we were a year ago. Cattle is basically back to where we were. However, I like to remind folks, it is one thing to catch back up and start processing animals, getting meat back on the counter, moving, having people at those livestock auctions out in the counties to bid on animals, to send them to feed. Those are all good things. It's one thing to do that. It's another thing to work through the backlog of animals. And we will continue to be working through that backlog of pigs for probably the rest of the year and into 2021. The thing that concerns me most is I continue to see indications of a demand drag on meat demand. Basically, we're not eating out as much, and we're not consuming as much protein, that higher priced protein at the store. And that is starting to sit in on some of these livestock prices, these future livestock prices. So if you're wondering why processing is back up to normal, but we really haven't seen that full return for auction prices down the road at the auction barn, it's largely because we're seeing this demand drag on protein animal products. Ethanol has returned to about 92%. I'm not confident in us staying there. And this has been a complete change. I was pretty confident that we could actually see increased ethanol demand as people were cautious about flying and driving more, basically picking up more driving miles because they didn't want to fly. What I think potentially could spill out in the ethanol market right now is if we do not go back to school, or if people do not send their kids back to school for whatever reason, and people are staying home, we will consume less gasoline, and that'll transcend into our ethanol market. So that remaining 8% on ethanol is going to be hard to get, and I actually could see it starting to come down a little bit from that, especially if we get into the fall and people just don't have, they have to stay at home because their children are home or something along those lines. It's going to be difficult, I think, for us to get back to 100%. Crop planting, we didn't hear any issues on crop planting, which was really great. We were really worried about logistics. And then, of course, we just talked about CFAP, PPP, and EIDL providing financial support. I've thrown in a little thing here about college football. This is, again, me just maybe being a little bit tongue-in-cheek in the fact that, certainly there's bigger issues to worry about than college football. The only reason I threw it in here is our market significantly reacted to college basketball when college basketball shut down in the spring. If we start seeing, and last week when the Big Ten and the Pac-12 announced that they were not doing conference games, that spilled over into our equity markets, and the flow of funds into the ags significantly decreased. If we saw an announcement that college football wasn't going to happen, I am confident we would see a corresponding market reaction in our equity funds. So just something to keep in mind as we think about that. It's just a big flashy topic that you might not think relates to ag, but it has, and we saw it in the basketball picture. Okay, grain stocks. I'm gonna go through these all real quick. So June 1 grain stocks that we got at the end of June came in lower than higher than expectation. So we had more grain on hand than we thought. They came in just over 5.2 billion bushels. The trade was expecting just under 5 billion bushels. And so what this ultimately means, David, if you go to the next slide. What this ultimately means, and you see that 273 million bushel stock there, that's the largest surprise, bearish surprise to the market that we'd seen since 2010, 2011, so June of 2011, which is a big bearish shock, meaning we didn't consume as much corn in the quarter as what most people thought. What we can do is that largely translates into our feed use. We can calculate everything else, exports, ethanol demand, because it has to go through a port or a processing facility, but we cannot categorize feed use. And so if we subtract everything out from production, David, if you go to the next slide, what we ended up with is here's the implied third quarter feed and residual use. And you can see at 772 million bushels, that's the lowest we've had all the way since back to 2010, 2011. This is those livestock issues of not feeding and pushing animals to what we, I say pushing, but not feeding them to our normal rates that we normally would, holding those back, trying to slow down growth, all the issues that we saw in the livestock supply chain, keeping cattle out in pasture longer, all those played a factor in this lower implied feed use number. So Dave, if you go to the next slide. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is about exports, corn exports. We've seen some really flashy corn export numbers out of China the last 6 days. Since last Friday, they've bought in about 1 billion bushels worth of worth of old crop corn, which is a really flashy number. Couple of reasons that I'm not totally surprised, but at the same time, it is a flashy number, and it's the largest purchase of corn China has made from anywhere in the world ever. So I mean, that's how big this purchase of corn that we saw over the last 5 days was. In fact, it was the biggest single day purchase all the way since 1994. So they're buying lots of corn. Part of the reason for this is what I'm showing you here is this is where our supplies of corn reside around the world. The black bar is the entire world. And you can see there that we are well supplied of corn globally. We do not have a shortage of corn. So do not get excited about bear markets. We have lots of corn worldwide. However, you subtract the Chinese and the United States out of this picture and you get that red bar. And you can see that we've been pretty flat the last couple of years, but if you go back, we're kind of in this tightest corn market all the way since 2001, 2002, at 36 days of supply. So this is how long we could go on our current corn supply without corn becoming available in other parts of the world. That's getting relatively tight. China is not an exporter of corn. They have lots of corn in strategic reserves. They have a big storage number. We have no idea. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how much corn they actually have, but you take them out of the picture, U.S. exports a lot of corn. So if you're looking for corn somewhere in the globe, the rest of the world's getting pretty tight. That's that red bar. So if you're looking for corn, the United States is a good place to come. So David, if you go to the next slide, please. So that's the export. Now looking at biofuel use. Again, we talked about this just a few minutes ago, but this is kind of the motor fuel picture. What I'm showing you here in the graph is a couple of years of gasoline demand by week. And so the purple line is a 5-year average, the black line is 2019, and the red line was so far 2019. The blue dotted line was my forecast based on basically surveys and interviewing oil refiners. What they expected to use for motor fuel the rest of the year. And you can see we've actually exceeded expectations so far. But nonetheless, we still have an 11% decline in annual fuel use. And that's not assuming flare-ups later this year, preventing us from going back to a normal driving pattern. But again, it's going to be hard to get that remaining 90%. Nonetheless, we've seen almost a 46% reduction at the worst in gasoline and fuel use. And given what I talked about with that percentage standard connection with biofuels, when we use less motor fuel, we're going to naturally use less ethanol. And so we've taken about 400 million bushels of corn used for ethanol out of our old crop. And we'll talk about that when we get later when I pull all this together. But that's important for this picture is ethanol has rebounded, but we're still struggling based on that usage value. David, if you go to the next slide. All right, soybeans, not a big surprise on stocks. Again, we can subtract all that out from the corn and we're left with the feed and residual use number. For soybeans, everything across the board is calculated, so we really don't have major surprises. We saw a big one last year. Again, that was we didn't have as many soybeans on hand as what we thought. That's that big red bar that's going down. That means that a lot of soybeans spoiled, probably up in the Northwest, in places where they were storing outdoors. It got wet, it molded, it spoiled, it just disappeared and wasn't tracked. So that was like a year ago. This year, a much smaller surprise to the market, but bullish. It was bullish. If you go to the next slide, David. So the one that we've been watching and the one that's been just fascinating to follow is soybean crush. And we're going to get the June numbers today at noon. And I'm expecting another record month of soybean crush. The red line there is 2019-2020, so our current year. Out of the 9 months that we have records for so far, 7 of those 9 months have broken a new record. So 2019-2020 has been a phenomenal year for soybean crush. That's our domestic demand picture. We saw some logistics issues in South America, our primary competitor for soybean meal. And as a result of their demand logistical issues, we were able to pick up some of that market. So we've seen really strong soybean crush so far this year. Today, the trade is expecting 162 million bushels of soybean crush for the month of June. I'm expecting it could be a little bit higher than that. So I expect soybeans to see a little nice pop this afternoon as we head into the afternoon trading hours. David, if you go to the next slide, please. However, the big story on soybeans has been our competition from South America, and I'm going to talk about China here in just a second. But what I'm showing you here on the left, these are 3 pictures of soybean carrying vessels heading from South America to China. And you can see the amount of ships in the ocean going from Brazil and South America to China. China has broken every import record known to man the last 3 months, and July looks to be another big month as well, of buying soybeans. And they're at the point where their ports are so full of ships with soybeans, they can't unload them all. I mean, there's just that many soybeans sitting at the ports. But what this has done, and they represent the graph to the right, and I showed this on this call before, it is giving Brazilian producers the incentive to produce more soybeans. And we do not have a soybean shortage here in the Western Hemisphere. Between the United States and Brazil, we have lots of soybeans. We had that billion bushel carry out last year. But as you can see, for US soybean prices, we've been flat to down. Brazilian producers, due to currency exchanges and the increased demand from China, have been given the market signal with that black line to continue to expand soybean production next year. So that's something we're going to have to watch. David, if you go to the next slide, because I want to tie this together with trade. So we've been talking a lot about will China meet their committed purchases of U.S. ag products. The president just had a press conference last night related to China, even though he didn't talk much about China. I think like the first 5 minutes were about China. The last hour was other stuff. Long story short is, are we on path? Are we on an appropriate path to meet these commitments under the phase 1 trade deal? As a reminder, what I'm showing you here in the graph is what those commitments meant in relation to what we had done. And these are in dollars, billions of dollars. So it's not just quantity, it's quantity times price. The 2020 probability, or the 2020 projection or proposal, I guess is what I should say, there's a $19.5 billion baseline. The red bar is the added commitments for this current year for U.S. ag products. And then there's a $5 billion we will strive, which I don't know what strive means. And I've told you all before, I strive to find a girlfriend, but that doesn't really work for me. So I'm not really sure what that means for China either. But due to exchange rates and global supplies with competition from the United States, I showed you the Brazilian real as it compares to the US dollar. The Russian ruble, which is a big competitor to the US and US wheat markets, has fallen as the Russian oil market has fallen. So Russia is supplying China with wheat because of their currency exchange. Brazil is supplying China with soybeans because of their currency exchange. And as a result, we've seen record shipments out of those countries to China. The thing that I find interesting, and I continue to see this pop up in Chinese media, when you hear when they do a press conference talking about their rapid imports and why they're importing so much right now, every single time they talk about how they handled the coronavirus the best in the world. Let me say that again. China believes they handled the coronavirus better than anybody else. And if it shut their ports down, it's only a matter of time before the rest of the world has to shut their ports down. And so they are hoarding right now. We've seen this in soybeans. I'm expecting here in the next couple of months, we could see rapid fire soybean exports from the United States because of this premise alone. Now, if coronavirus shuts our US ports down, everything's game. I'm not expecting that. I have more faith in our US ports. But that is why China is buying so much ag products right now, is they firmly believe that they handled it the best. It's only a matter of time before everybody has to shut down as well. It's weird. It's a weird thing. But nonetheless, there it is. David, if you go to the next slide, please. All right, let's look at acreage real quick, and then I'll pull this all together. So we got the acreage numbers for what U.S. producers planted across the country. What I'm showing you here, this is a map of acres, soybean acres per state, and then the percent change from the previous year. So not surprising, soybean acres saw a pretty nice rebound across the country. Almost all states saw an increase of soybean acres this year compared to last year. The primary reason for that is we had large amounts of prevent plant last year, as you all know. We took a lot of soybean acres and turned them into corn prevent plant. However, the reason I'm starting with soybean acres and not corn is when this soybean number came out and we were sitting here and I was talking to producers and I wasn't really hearing those large transitions from corn to soybean acres, I started to get really worried that we were going to see a really large corn number and that corn was going to be overly bearish. I was very negative and pessimistic about corn because I was just sitting there going, my gosh, if we don't transition to soybeans, what are we going to do with these acres? So that's soybeans. David, if you go to the next slide. And here's corn. So for all purpose acres, we came in at 92 million acres of corn, which was 5 million acres below the March planting intentions number at 97 and 3 million acres below the trade estimate of 95 million acres. Now we increased corn acres here in Ohio, Michigan, Eastern Corn Belt, but where I was surprised was places like Iowa and Minnesota. And the reason why is they saw really quick planting this spring. Normally when we see rapid planting and corn's going in the ground and producers are rolling, they tend to plant more corn. They just keep planting because the conditions are right. And we didn't see that. And so I sit here and I go, wow, that was a big relief. And as a result, David, if you go to the next slide, what I'm going to show you here is this was the reaction to that acreage number. So the dots on the side, those represent individual industry expectations. The red dot represents USDA's estimate. So you can see in March that USDA came in higher than everybody else and we saw the market collapse. In June, everybody else was higher than USDA, and as a result, we saw 13 to 15 cent rises in the corn market. It was a big surprise. The reason for this, David, if you go to the next slide, I expect here in the next month, we're going to see a lot of those acres show up in the prevent plant report. I'm expecting there was quite a few acres that went into prevent plant, but to me, the biggest story here is total principal crop acres of all crops. So now we're looking at wheat, corn, soybeans, hay, alfalfa, cotton, rice, peanuts, the whole shebang came in at 312 million acres. That's down 2.3 from the planting intentions report, but up 3.1 from prevent plant in 2019. Again, we had a lot of prevent plant acres. If you look at the total acreage number, we had been for 16 through 18, we've been hovering a total acreage number around 318 to 319 million acres. Last year, we had the 17, 18 million acres of prevent plant that took production out. We took it and put it in prevent plant. This year, a more normal year, and we're only at 312. So the message here was part of the reason why we didn't see that giant corn acreage number is we shrunk the amount of total principal crop acreage we had. And I expect a good chunk of those to show up on prevent plant, but I also think some just went back to permanent pasture because I don't think, and Peggy, close your ears, I don't think we've taken that many acres and put them to solar panels. I don't think that's the case. I think they're probably in prevent plant and permanent pasture, but next slide, please. So here was the change in acreage across the board. You saw the big almost 8 million acre increase in soybean acres from last year, corn 3 million acres. Together, that 10 million acres, we had about 15 million acres of corn and soybean prevent plant last year. So we're still 5 million acres short where we were. I think that's well within the realm of possibility of corn prevent plant acres this year, given that I'm hearing out of North Dakota, there's 2 million acres expected to be in prevent plant already in their FSA office. That's what producers had already reported to their local FSA office. So big prevent plant acres in North Dakota. So I think that 5 million acres of prevent plants within the realm. The big surprise to me was winter wheat acres down there at the bottom. We lost almost another 1 million acres of winter wheat. Let me explain. Diane talked really nicely about the spreads in dairy. We kind of have those same issues with spreads in wheat. So we grow soft red winter wheat here in Ohio primarily. That comes off the Chicago Board of Trade. My family and folks in Kansas and Missouri, we grow hard red winter wheat, and that comes out of Chicago. Normally, there's about a 30 to 40 cent premium for hard red winter wheat over soft red winter wheat. However, this year, that has switched. The soft red winter wheat contracts are trading at a premium to soft red winter wheat. And I think that just signals that there is a demand and there is a market for soft winter wheat. So when I look at Ohio and I sit here and people ask me, should we grow wheat? It's starting. I mean, if you can do it if you can take the straw and you have the time to take the straw off, it could be a pretty attractive given that bump and premiums that we've seen. What was it? 4 months ago, soft red winter wheat was trading at $5.65 a bushel. So there is potential with wheat, and I was surprised to see all wheat classes fall another 1 million acres. David, next slide, please. All right, so let's look at crop conditions. I'm going to start with soybeans again, and this is thanks to the good folks at Intel FC Stone or StoneX up in Bowling Green. They pulled this together for me, and I really appreciate it. Basically, what I want to show you here is this is how people report the crop being across the country, across the Midwest. The big ones here to watch are the bold numbers at the top. That represents what the crop is conditioned at, what percentage of the crop is good to excellent. So for instance, there at Iowa, they're saying that 83% of the crop in Iowa is good or excellent. Last week it was 84, so it came down 1%. You look out here at the Eastern Corn Belt, look at Ohio. Last week we were at 57, this week we were at 51, signaling that we are seeing some challenges with some dry weather in especially the northwest part of the state, taking some top end potential off those yields. However, as I always say, it's hard to bet against the ice states. And if you look at Iowa that saw an increase, Wisconsin that saw an increase, Minnesota was left flat, you add in Illinois that saw a slight decrease, Indiana that saw a slight decrease, and Nebraska, that's 70% of our corn crop. So a good chunk of our corn crop is still in really good, excellent conditions or above average. Let's put it that way. 70% of our corn crop is at or above average this time of the year. Ohio, we're 1% below our average for this time of the year. So now what I want to do is I've asked retailers across the country what the crops look like in their area, because we're basically now in a weather market. This is demand fundamentals aren't going to do us anything. We are now in a weather market. So David, if you'd hit enter. So what I have done is I've asked ag retailers across the country to give me a description of the crop in their area. And this is what I've done. I've just put it in here so you can look at it. You can read these. I'll talk through a couple of them. The ones in Iowa were very interesting. It's basically a case of two states in Iowa. East of I-35, which runs diagonal through the state. Basically, if you know where Kansas City is and you know where Minneapolis is, I-35 connects the two. East of I-35, crops look great on their way to a record-breaking booming year. West of I-35 in the western part of Iowa, dryness is starting to take off some production, even though they got some nice rains overnight. In Minnesota, again, looking towards a really strong record-breaking crop in Minnesota. Missouri, dryness on the west. Northern Missouri got some great rains overnight. Wisconsin, great. The guy up there said almost ideal conditions, hot, humid, but we have moisture, and corn likes hot and humid if it has some moisture. Here in Ohio, the elevator I talked to said corn and soybeans both could use a nice rain. And again, this elevator was in north central Ohio. The areas that did get rain last week will lose some yield, while some more important areas, or more fortunate areas, not important, fortunate areas will fight to live another week. And so basically we're not out of the woods yet in Ohio, but the rains did help and provided some information. Indiana, Illinois, basically the outlook for weather is looking better now than it did a week ago. The rains helped this weekend. They need some more water. So that's soybeans. If you go to corn, which is the next slide, here's the corn outlook, largely the same picture. Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, Wisconsin, really favorable conditions. We're starting to really struggle here in Ohio. And again, you can kind of point that out and see where the issues are. This is on the corn side. And then if you go to the next point, which is really what's going to drive us the next couple of weeks, here's the U.S. drought monitor. This is of last week. You'll get updated today. You can see where the drought areas are. Northwest Ohio, pretty dry. Western Missouri, that western part of Iowa, like I talked about, which really matches our conditions that the elevators provided to me before. Rains in some of these parts are going to help. So for instance, Indiana got some nice showers the last week. Southern Iowa and that southwest part of Iowa got some really nice $1 million rains overnight. So just something to keep in mind. I'm not going to do weather. That's Aaron Wilson's thing. I'll throw that out there for this. All right, next slide. What has happened? What's actually been driving our corn market? Well, this time of year, two things drive our corn market. Weather, creating weather scares. And oh, by the way, I should have added this to the Chinese market. U.S. end producers, so elevators, ethanol plants, people that buy corn for feed, they tend to be behind a little bit on getting excited about weather scares. So for instance, if the radar turns hot and dry, they don't react too crazy. They don't get really excited. Chinese buyers do. Anytime there's a weather scare, they're like, oh, we got to get corn. So I think that's part of the decision behind some of these markets. However, weather is a big thing, and weather does drive our market. However, lately, the rise that we saw in corn markets has really been a fund management. So what I'm showing you here, that black line is our current year. And this is basically, there was a almost record short position. Meaning that everybody was pretty sure corn markets were going to go down. When the weather started turning a little dry and we had less acres than we thought, people started buying back their positions, their sold positions. They started buying those back. That created some, basically what I like to call invisible demand, meaning that nothing changed on the fundamental side, but because people were buying back futures contracts, it was providing support for those corn markets. And so you can see the increase that we've seen in the corn markets as you move forward. So that's the second thing that's driving our market right now, our corn market. I expect, and we've seen over the last couple of days, that short positions start to increase again. So right now we're kind of sitting here going, the market isn't necessarily telling us that we're going to have a weather scare. Funds are starting to go short again on a large US crop, and we're not seeing the demand strength that we had hoped we would see. That should point us all to, over the next 3 weeks, we continue to see downward pressure on corn prices. David, next slide, please. So corn balance sheet real quick. All I've done here is I've taken the June USDA numbers there in the first column versus the July old crop numbers there in the second column. And these were the adjustments they made last week. Largely matched my expectations. I actually still, the only part I was off was on ethanol, but they reduced feed and residual use 100 million bushels. Again, we had more corn than we thought we did. And so therefore that implies a lower feed use. So they lowered feed use 100 million bushels. They dropped ethanol another 50 million bushels. I still expect 25 more. I've been saying all along 75. But I also want to point out that we've taken almost 500 million bushels out of our corn demand, out of that ethanol category. I was at 450 back in April. When we did this webinar back in April, I was at 450, and we've almost taken 500 million out. So roughly about that same area. They did not change exports, even though we've seen these large purchases, because it wasn't in time for them to be included in the report. However, I expect that export number to push up close to 1.8.5 million bushels. So an extra 50 to 100 million bushels of demand in the export column for old crop. David, if you go to the next slide, please. So this is the new crop. So again, in the middle there, within the black bars in the middle, this is our new crop for 2020. So the crop that's growing right now. We took 1 billion bushels out of production on those lower acreage numbers. Right now, the crop model suggests that we are on pace for a trend or above trend yield. Hard to believe, I know, but that's where we're on pace. But still, we took 1 billion bushels of supply out of production by reducing acreage. They lowered feed use on those lower numbers. Basically, if the crop isn't as big, if we shrink the size of the crop, we're going to shrink that residual use. So they lowered feed and residual use 200 million bushels. We saw food use, not ethanol, but food use increased 25 million bushels, basically increasing food purchase like corn chips and stuff like that. They left ethanol the same. I think that ethanol number is maybe a little bit high, given the challenges we could see with driving in the next couple of months. So again, that's where we are at. It comes out to about a $3.35 average farm cash price for the year. That's below where we're at right now, signaling again that we're going to fall below that. And then I've provided 2 scenarios over to the side in terms of how we could get close to $4 corn, or where we could actually drop back to $3. It all stems from that yield estimate. If we have a 180 yield, which is a little bit above trend line yield, this is what we're looking at: continued downward pressure on corn price. If we fall all the way down to a 170 bushel yield, which would still be above last year's yield, we still don't get to $4. So I think, if I look at Diane, and Diane's sitting over there crunching all her farm business analysis numbers, most of them point that somewhere around that $3.90 to $4, $4.15 is a really good break-even cost of production. And I'm sitting here looking at this saying, it's going to be challenging to get, up to those cost of production numbers, given just the corn fundamentals that we've seen right now. And I don't know, Diane, if you have anything. I didn't mean to call you out, but I guess that's what it signals to me, is that we're still not low enough on cost of production to meet our corn prices. David, if you go to the next slide, please. And I promise I'm almost done. I've kept you bored this long. I'm almost done. Oh, one back. Yep. So same thing on soybeans is what we did on corn. USDA's numbers in June versus July. They increased soybean crush again. I think we'll see another strong soybean crush report today. They did lower residual use quite a bit. Again, we weren't surprised by that stocks number, and so they did lower residual use. What that does is that actually gives us, you know, a little bit more carry out into the next year, but nothing major to change our soybean price from a season average price. And keep in mind, we've got 10 months of the year behind us at this point, so it's going to take some major prices in the cash market to actually get big movements in a season average price. Next slide, please. So new crop, so this is the soybean crop that's in the ground. Again, we made very few changes to the supply, actually. We only went up 8 million bushels on the supply because we didn't see major changes in acreage or yield. So only up 8 million bushels in the supply numbers. They did increase crushing 15 million bushels given the strong crushing this year. We expect it to grow about 3% between a 2-year period, and that puts us on line for that soybean crushing number right there. As a result, we're getting down below that 10% stocks to use number, which is a very positive sign, but we do need to go further to get back up to $9.50 soybeans. I've put my bearish and bullish scenarios over here to the side. I will tell you that I favor more towards the bullish side on soybeans, mostly due to the fact that I think we are going to see large demand for soybeans here in the next couple of months, coupled with, you know, to me, it just feels that soybeans has got more room to give. We don't have those large soybean stocks or fund positions on soybeans. And so there is a chance that soybeans could go bullish with very little change in markets. If we have a small yield decline, that's positive to the market. If China comes in and buys a couple of million metric tons of soybeans above what they normally would, that'd be positive to the market too. So I'm a little bit more bullish on soybeans than I am corn. David, if you go to the next slide, please. I'll just finish up with this. So this is new crop corn prices for Ohio over the last several decades. And I think I've showed you this. I showed this out on the road. No matter where our price points are for crops, you know, back in 2012, we were at $13 soybeans, $14 soybeans. In the 70s, we had high soybean prices due to inflation. In the 80s, they crashed. What I've done is I've just made these seasonalities and looking at when, based on an average marketing year price for the year, when is the corn price the highest, when is it the lowest? And June and July every year always tend to be, or I shouldn't say every year, but when taken as a decade, on average, tend to be our highest. The one exception was the 1970s, which led to the great grain robbery that a lot of people still talk about, and high inflation that was driving prices higher. You know, that's the one exception. But I guess if I'm sitting here looking at this, I expect soft corn prices through the remainder of the month and into August. So if you've got old corn crop that you're sitting on in your bin unpriced, and you've got a pretty large 2020 corn crop coming, you know, there's not a lot of chances, I think, to move it. And a couple weeks ago, or back in the beginning of July, would have been a really nice time to move some corn if you still had corn. But even to looking at pricing some corn, unless we have a big thing that shocks the market that we can't predict come this winter, we're going to be sitting on lower corn prices to start next spring than we are right now. So next slide, please, and I'll finish up with basis. Basis is that localized price factor. This is new crop corn basis with a change over the last month. And again, I want to thank Intel FC StoneX for putting this together. Sometimes they listen to me. I asked for this, and they thought they respond. They're like, we don't have that data, but it's a good idea, so we'll work on it. And I really appreciate them doing this for me. If you look there at Ohio, we've seen really positive basis in Northwest Ohio to the tune of about 10-15 cent increases in basis over the last month. That's really good news. That's good news for our producers, especially when we saw futures markets also increasing. Part of this is ethanol plants coming back on production. The other part of this is we just didn't have a lot of corn last year. So we're getting to that point where we're running low on corn out across the countryside. People are having to work harder for ethanol or for corn. I think we could have saw some really exciting things in basis this year had we not had the extreme drought in Southwest Kansas. So you look down here and you see these higher basis prices coming up in Southwest Kansas. That's pulling corn at the Mississippi River back towards Kansas instead of flowing out here to Ohio. So I think we could have seen some really interesting basis on corn had that drought in Western Kansas not popped up and started pulling corn back, you know, out of Missouri, Iowa to Kansas instead of Ohio. Soybean slide, please, David. Here's the soybean basis slide. Again, we've seen some strength in soybean basis over the last month for new crop soybeans, really pretty consistent across the Corn Belt without, minus some regions in Northwest Kansas using that for feed use. And then, so that's soybean basis. And then my summary slide, if you will, David. So summary, corn stocks remain large, period. We took 5 million acres out of the corn picture. We took 1 billion bushels out of production, but we still have a lot of corn globally. That has not changed. The fundamentals are kicking back in, and you're seeing corn price start to slide again on the realization that we got excited. We thought we might have a dry summer with less acres. Basically, it's taken some of the cushion out of the market, but we still have lots of corn. It's forecasted the second largest corn crop, even with our weekend demand. So a lot of corn out there. Brazil and U.S. continue to compete for soybean sales. Exchange rates continue to be important both for consumers and producers. Chinese demand remains an unknown factor, even with ASF starting to pop back up in China in certain places in their hog herd, African swine fever. For wheat, winter wheat yields have been disappointing through much of the country. That's allowed for the wheat market to provide some support to price, but still not enough to really change the picture. But global wheat stocks remain elevated. When we saw the run up of coronavirus cases, we saw a lot of people buy flour, and as a result, we saw that surge in wheat prices, but it's now coming down from that. And then just my marketing piece here. I encourage a flexible marketing plan. Look for opportunities to forward contract with strong basis and futures prices. Many elevators are offering over-the-counter products to reduce margin call risk. Those could be an option to lock in some prices. And then keep an eye on those basis as we see improving basis here in the Eastern Corn Belt. Once we get in, we find the size of our crop that could significantly reduce our basis prices. And so just something to keep in mind. So with that, I'm done. Any comments? Anybody want to add anything? I'm done.
And I didn't know, we haven't seen any. We had a question that was on the PPP that's been answered. Do we have any questions? Now's your time to put them into the Q&A box. Not just as far as upcoming farm office. Again, we had some cash flow thoughts maybe talking today, but we knew we had way too many topics to discuss. So our cash flow special farm office will be on September 16th. Barry already mentioned the tax update on August 13th. And then Ben, you might want to say you're going to have an update at the end of August on a biofuels update as well. And then of course, with the announcement of the Farm Science Review going virtual yesterday, that means our Ask the Expert stage, where we have 20 different experts talking about a whole host of subjects, will probably be going virtual. So bottom line is we'll keep you posted, and for you to keep up to date, just go to go.osu.edu/farm office, and then you'll be able to see any of the updates on those programs that will be coming up over the next couple months. So with that, we're up against the time. I didn't know if we had any closing comments from our panelists, Barry, Peggy, Diane, Ben.
I wanted to answer Diane's question about the 1099 question on custom farm.
Beautiful.
Work. That should go on the new 1099 NEC. So that's going to have to be moved over. So it's going to create a little bit more work for most people to fill out different kinds of 1099s now.
It'll be, I'm sure we'll have more information out in articles and some assistance going forward on that, on some articles coming up. All right, with that, Ben, Diane, Peggy, Barry, as always, we appreciate the work that you do here on Farm Office Live. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop any of us a line. With that, we're going to sign off and just wish everyone a great week.